I do have two strings to my bow. I started out 20 years ago now looking at the ridiculous idea that communities can create their own forms of money through local exchange trading systems, which I knew was the most stupid idea in the world, and Robert Owen had tried that in the 19th century, hadn't he, and that didn't get us very far. But for the last 20 years, people have been creating alternative forms of currency quite successfully. And one of the interesting things I've noticed through my engagement with transition towns and low carbon communities is I see a lot of old friends and old faces who've been working at this for some time. But if it's okay with you, I won't talk about that side of it. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about my low carbon work at the city level and the city region level. This came about in 2007 when I had a discussion with a physical geographer at the top of the Roxby building, and I'd read somewhere a crazy idea that the planet's climate can flip literally within a stage of years from one stage to another stage, that there's examples of that in the geological record. And I said to a physical geographer who knows, surely that's not the case, surely this climate change is overrated, it's not that bad, is it? And he said, yes it is, be afraid, be very afraid. And he showed me the Nature papers, the unpleasant story in the ice record that there may be change. At the same time, I had my daughter, and something changes people when they have a child and they realise these things they're very, very concrete. So I'm going to talk about two things I've done in Liverpool, and hopefully I'll introduce some of the more abstract and concrete academic issues that we've been talking about through the story. We're talking about the transition to a sustainable future. So what does sustainable mean? And can it be locally led? Or what does locally mean? And as geographers, we know that places are not Russian dolls. There's the idea of globalisation. There's the idea of geographies of responsibility. Places are formed through global processes, and places create those global processes. So those are the two questions I want to unpick a bit. What do we mean by sustainability? Of course, you know, going back to Timo Riordan's work from the 1970s, we got concepts of strong sustainability and weak sustainability. For some people, a low carbon future will be pretty much like it is at the moment, but electric powered. So we don't need a big socio-economic change in society. We need those nuclear power stations, and we need to get them in as quickly as we can. And we also need renewable energy. We need wind farms, we need solar powers. But perhaps we need to be thinking more of big offshore wind powers in the Irish Sea or the North Sea, rather than more community-based ones. How much power do they generate? How quickly can they come online? And who benefits from those? So I started off by taking the second view. There was that fantastic cartoon somebody showed that we all look at. What happens if we made the transition to a low-carbon economy and actually we didn't need to? I started off by working through the idea of transition towns, and I'm sure everybody knows what transition towns are, this idea that there is this Goldilocks zone of community action. Individual change is great, but perhaps a little bit too slow. Don't hold your breath for the COP processes. So there's something about this idea that we can act locally. I had a PhD student, Noel Longhurst, check out his work, it's very, very good. He looked at TESS. He did an ethnography of the transition town movement in TESS. And he identified that there are certain places where large numbers of people that have a strong environmental ethos can rock up. And perhaps you can lead that transition to a low carbon future at a very community level where you've got enough people in one place to help you do that. There's some work looking at Bristol, looking at the large numbers of environmental activists in places like Bristol, which suggests you can do a little bit more than that. So there are certain places, we know where they are, the Totnesses, the Lewises, the Brixtons, the Todmordons, the Hebden Bridges, where you've got large numbers of people coming together to do something interesting. So we invited Rob Hopkins up to Liverpool, the guy that started Transition Towns down in Totnes, and we said, that's all very well, Rob, you're in Totnes, we're in Liverpool. How is this going to work in Liverpool? And Rob's brilliant. He said, I don't know, mate, I don't live here, you do. So you work it out and you tell us what the process was. So we had a debate about, what should locally led mean for us? I sent an email out. I expected 2 people and a dog to come along to this meeting like you normally do when you do activism. and we had a meeting of 70 people right from the beginning. So something had changed there about the power of Facebook, social media, the internet, groups moving stuff around each other, which means you can quite quickly manifest people in a room where there's an idea that's around, like transition towns, and get people doing things quite quickly. So that was really, really, really positive. But we immediately said, well, what do we mean by locally? So some people wanted to work at the household or a street level. They wanted to take the transition streets approach, where you get people talking about their individual transitions, climate action groups, looking at growing their own food locally, putting solar panels on their roofs, looking at insulating the houses, work at a very, very, very local area. Some people close to the Green Party, the area of Liverpool I live in, it's the Green Commune. We've got 3 Green Party councillors. Outside our area, there isn't quite so many Green Party people over there. So they were interested in working in this part of the city and looking at ways that we could get more people involved to manifest this green network. Other people said, we're all a bit middle class, aren't we? We're all a bit white. Do we want to make sure that this transition is a just transition, and we need to go and work in North Liverpool and in places like some of the housing estates that we were at? Other people thought, I think there's plenty of people in Liverpool. The transition to a low-carbon economy isn't the top thing on their agenda. In no way are they consuming too much. In no way have they got too much stuff. And no way are part of the future, part of the problem. These are people who probably need to be able to have the ability to consume more. Talking about no growth can be difficult in a place where people have been unemployed for 20 years. So we needed to think about that. So some people said, no, one of the interesting things about sort of the activisty stuff is that this is people who are globally privileged taking responsibility for doing something about a problem rather than blaming somebody else. And that's the way I looked at it, really. I liked Doreen Massey's ideas of geographies of responsibility. Those of us in the global north do what we can before we start throwing stones at Brazil, Russia, India, China for all their terrible consumption. Now, it's particularly interesting for me as well because I'm in Liverpool. It's UNESCO World Heritage status for global mercantile capitalism. So we know where this problem started. It started on the banks of the Mersey and it went all over the world. So if you look at Liverpool's emissions, because we're a city that's got great problems and because we've deindustrialised, our emissions are going down. We're doing our bit. You look out into the Irish Sea, you'll see huge windmills all over the place. We're contributing more than our fair share of decarbonisation to the UK economy. So I talk to people in the City Council about what we need to do, and we say, what are you on about, Pete? We're doing our bit. In fact, we're doing more than our bit. How many big cities can you look out and see windmills in the sea? And they've got a point. So that means it's all your fault. It's not our fault in Liverpool. We're doing our bit. And it's particularly the fault of people in China and Brazil and Russia and India. Other people would take the Doreen Massey line that geographies of responsibility mean that this city needs to do a lot more about that. So I then thought it's fantastic that we're doing community activism, but a lot of the great local activities that go on are based on an unsustainable baseload. So I was talking to somebody in the break about things that are going on in Scotland, and it's fantastic, but we also know the SNP government wants to cut airport fuel duty, and it's based on fossil fuels out in the North Sea for the oil economy. Liverpool's just as problematic as that. It's doing lots of things, but it's based on the import of stuff from China, which doesn't add to our accounts. So we need to think about it in a little bit more complicated than that. I got a bit tired of hearing about Växjö in Sweden, which is fantastic. It's the world's greenest city it builds itself at. But it's based on nuclear baseload. I heard somebody from Aalborg in Denmark telling me that Aalborg was moving to a zero carbon city because it's powering itself through rubbish. And the guy said, yeah, this is all rubbish that comes from Britain, ha 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 ha. So that's problematic. So what I wanted to do, I thought, fantastic that people want to work at a more community level, but I wanted to see if I could work more at a city region level. And I managed to get some money from the Economic and Social Research Council under their KE money, Knowledge Exchange money. And I spoke to interesting people at the Chamber of Commerce and Liverpool Vision, which is our economic development company, and Groundwork. And they wanted to answer the question, what can we do to combine prosperity with what we need to do in Liverpool to avoid dangerous climate change? This was at the time when there were lots of mini Sterns flying around. And for the first time, Nicholas Stern had done that fantastic job of convincing the neoliberals that it's actually far better to engage in adaptation now and mitigation now than it is to just pay the bills in the future. So we quite quickly gathered together a more of a partnership of the institutions that were interested in this question because they didn't know. This was the period when the last Labour government was in power, so there was lots of money sloshing about at a regional level for the regional development agencies to fund community groups and to fund businesses to make carbon reductions. So we did a little bit of an audit about what was going on, and then the election came along and the coalition came through. And we found pretty quickly that perhaps a lot of the stuff that we thought that was there has now gone. So what can we do? Is it that we give up because there are now no targets, or are people interested in doing something about moving that transition on? And the good news was that I found people that were interested in making that transition. I found lots of individual business people that wanted to do things for their own businesses. Interestingly, we fixed on this idea of a bid to be European green capital because that connected up with our institutions, our agencies interested in ensuring the prosperity of Liverpool into the future. And we started to having questions about what do you mean by prosperity? Do you just mean growth of stuff? Or do you mean people having more fun, people having more enjoyable lives? How can we keep Liverpool's thriving visitor economy going without it being based on jetting into the city? How can we be based in people coming to the city by public transport, staying longer and making sure that the hotels are as sustainable as we possibly can? We've got a big port in Liverpool. A lot of the stuff that's going on in many ports is about making ports as green as possible. So we could do certain things, but we had to frame it around messages around neoliberalisation. This is the best way to keep this city prosperous into the future, which a lot of people that take a harder view of sustainability wouldn't be happy with making that bargain. I was happy with making that bargain because I felt that way you're going to get the sort of influence at a city region level to start to move things on. The other thing we found quite quickly was that people could see the benefits of thinking about adaptation. That was a no-brainer. Sustainable future locally adaptation, yes. Every place has got to address its adaptation problems. And we had no problem with getting people to do that. The third thing we managed to make the connections through, when we talk about a sustainable future, we started looking at the ideas of people like Richard Florida, saying that the future prosperity of cities are not necessarily about the growth of so much stuff, but people want interesting places to live in. They want to be able to cycle, they want green spaces, they want countryside, they want a prosperous ecosystem, but also a vibrant ecosystem. So we started to make those kind of connections that, yes, the future doesn't necessarily need to be totally neoliberal. I started to move away from ideas I had when I was younger that capitalism is always ecocidal. I think now that with disruptive technology changes, with ways of thinking about prosperity in different ways, it's possible to make bargains with elite groups who want to move to a sustainable future without necessarily thinking that it's all doom and gloom. Paper in a geographical review and one coming out hopefully in EPA, which talks about this in more detail. Thank you.